4, 3, 2, 1. Caution, fragments of silicon may be sharp.
Welcome to another installment of the Fragments of Silicon European interviews. This week we have John Day of Abstraction Games. Right, so we should start by introducing you to the audience, as we have had Abstraction Games on the program before. It's just Ralph, the company, usually represented, but that's no longer as viable as it once was. There's a whole story there that we don't have time to get into. But anyway, so we'd like to start our interviews by asking the interviewee how video games, both on a personal and professional level.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. So I first, I think about as early as I can really remember. I grew up in Salt Lake City in the 1980s, and my dad ran a technology company that was actually a direct competitor of IBM. And they wrote their own software and hardware for inventory control and accounting systems. And as a result, we had equipment around the house for as long as I can remember. I think the first system I ever played on was an amber and black screen compact 8088 based system. And the first games I remember playing were Digger and Hard Hat Mac by Electronic Arts. And I think you can play both of those in a browser today. But yeah, so that was kind of the beginning of my fascination with computers and gaming. And I think I've had my hands on just about every gaming system between then and now. So that was how I got interested at the very beginning.
And well, moving forward, how did that translate into entering the industry? Like, did you go to school for it, or did you train for something else and end up in this line of work?
Sure. Video games remained a passion for up until now from then. But I was always kind of curious about how technology works, and got into programming a little bit fairly young. I had the benefit of having an older brother who was almost 10 years older than I was, who was also into this sort of thing. And he exposed me to a lot of programming nuance. And programming was kind of a hobby thing. I was putting together my own games in like BASIC teenager. And eventually I ended up getting a job as just a general support guy for a simulator company that made military and airline simulators called Evans and Sutherland out of Salt Lake. And then I later worked as a programmer for the University of Utah, where I was a student. And ultimately landed a gig as a tester for a small independent software or video game company in Salt Lake called Avalanche Software. They are still there. And so I started there as a temporary tester, testing the E3 demo for a game called 25 to Life. And after the contract was up, they elected to keep me on as a permanent tester, where I was working on, Tak and the Power of Juju 2 was, I think, the first game. And they were later acquired by the Walt Disney Company, and I ended up spending about 10 years with Avalanche Software.
Oh, wow.
Where I went from kind of tester to designer to, assistant producer, associate producer, and so on. And then later I ended up at Crytek for a little while, which is available in early access now, and now I'm here. as head of production.
Yeah, that's quite the lineage.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Well, like, what were some of the games you worked at Disney Interactive?
I mean, the most well-known stuff is certainly the Disney Infinity franchise. I was there for Disney Infinity 1, 2, and part of 3. I left there during the production of Disney Infinity 3. Cars 2 and Toy Story 3 were both games. So it was a lot of stuff to support the movies, as you would expect at Disney, you know, but good stuff. I'm proud of them.
Those were like different positions for each game, considering your move up the ladder.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was in test for Dragon Ball Z Saga's Evolution. I was also in test for that. I was a designer on a game called Meet the Robinsons. Franchise. And I think it was kind of after Meet the Robinsons and also Tak and the Power of Juju 3. I also worked on as a designer. And I think kind of the consensus after that was I was kind of a mediocre designer, but I was pretty good at managing people and things. And so, you know, in sort of determining which direction my career should take, you know, the studio head said, you know, maybe you might want to try this. And I went, oh, okay. And that seemed to be where things sort of stuck. And then I was a producer, everything after that. So like Disney's Bolt was my first project as a producer. And then, like the Toy Story 3, Cars 2, Disney Infinity saga kind of kicked off, and that comprised most of my career there.
Well, what was it like working on Disney Infinity?
Disney Infinity was great. I mean, it was a chance to do something really original. I mean, I guess by definition, any game at Disney is sort of derivative only because you're using pre-existing intellectual property. But, you know, at Disney, internally, as you can imagine, there's a lot of people that are very protective of various IPs, right? Like there's a guy, his name's Jay Ward, and he is the legacy guardian for the Cars franchise. That is his job title. He's the legacy guardian. It's his job to make sure that if you do something that has Cars characters in it, that it's done appropriately, right? And you can imagine if they have a guy like that for Cars, just imagine what it's like for Mickey Mouse, right? Like it's like there's a whole committee. And normally, Disney's usually pretty cagey about allowing these worlds and characters to overlap. Infinity was a game that was exactly about doing this very thing, and we got away with it, and it felt like kind of this major coup within gaming and within Disney to bring all this different intellectual property together. I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, I've heard other tales of Disney being very with its properties in that fashion. I'm like, even like going all the way back to the 80s, they had rules, and like a game like Mickey Mania is kind of amazing in ways we don't have time to discuss. But so getting back on track here,
Sure.
what did your lead to leaving Disney Interactive Avalanche?
Well, I mean, I think that it was more than anything, it was looking for a new challenge, right? It was like, okay, I want to do something that's a little bit different than what I'd been doing there, and I was interested in furthering and growing my career. And you know, the gaming division at the time at Disney wasn't growing, and it actually basically doesn't exist now. They decided ultimately to kind of pursue a licensing heavy, opposed to an internal development heavy model. So you know, in some ways, I feel like I kind of got while the getting was good.
Yeah, I remember the announcement of like Disney Interactive basically getting shuttered after Infinity 3.
Correct. That's correct.
I mean, Avalanche is still alive, just now part of Warner Brothers.
That is correct.
Anyway, so what was it like working for which branch of Crytek did you work for?
I was in Frankfurt, Germany. So main Crytek.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And I imagine that was a kind of a jarring experience going from Utah to Frankfurt.
Oh, it was a little different, I suppose. I mean, make no mistake, man. Avalanche and Crytek are both just, you know, another quirky game company. I think they have more in common than they have differences, despite what you may think of as substantial cultural difference or whatever. But no, I mean, Crytek was another group of passionate bonkers gamers turned professionals trying to do something cool and trying to somehow keep the doors open in the process. I don't know that it was terrifically different. And of all the places you can travel in the world and experience a little culture shock, Germany's not really the place that's going to happen. I mean, yeah, okay, they speak German, and there's a few cultural particularities, but for the most part, it's just not that different. It wasn't. Adapting to Germany as an American is pretty easy compared to some of the other places I've lived. Yeah, I don't know that it was a huge. It was super awesome. Like I think had it made sense to stay in Germany, I would have done it. Like I really enjoyed it. Just in Frankfurt last weekend, actually.
And how long did you work for?
I was there for about a year and a half. Mm-hmm.
Like, and suppose we should delineate exactly how Crytek and Avalanche are similar, like beyond the passion level, because I admittedly am having a hard time visualizing that because the output differentials. It's like,
well, okay.
Yeah, it's like one puts out licensed games based off of movies, and the other puts out pretty violent FPSs, among other things.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's absolutely true that, like, one of the core tenets of Crytek is that they produce and own their own IP, right? And clearly Avalanche does not have that. But in terms of how they work kind of day to day, I wouldn't say it's particularly different. I mean, even within, so you look at Disney, right? And you go, okay, Disney has all this IP and we're putting them in our game and it's based on this movie and there's all kind of these consistency restrictions, but there's still like a ton of creative and technical innovation that goes on at Avalanche, despite the fact that they do, I guess, what you'd think of as licensed or even, heaven forbid, derivative products. They're really not, I mean, there's still a lot of very original, innovative, creative work there. So I think that, yeah, you're right. Avalanche Software did not develop The Incredibles as an IP, but, the entire story for The Incredibles playset in Disney Infinity was done totally in-house. Like, there's plenty of original stuff.
True enough. Like, especially like in Disney Infinity.
Yeah.
From what I remember, that game was less restrictive than, say, something like Meet the Robinsons, which is directly based off of a movie. And, usually the intent behind like direct movie adaptations is to make it as close as to the movie as possible.
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily true. In fact, I think a lot of games get criticized for that, and that it's absolutely true that what works in one medium doesn't necessarily work in another medium. I mean, how many times have you heard, like, when they make a movie out of a book, it's like, the book was better, right? Like, there's certain things that make it shine that don't in another. And so I think, in video games, we start looking for, well, what is it that we can take from this IP and this movie, whatever it is, and what's going to make for a good game, right? Not how can we recreate the beats of the movie in this game. It's how can we kind of take the strength of the IP and maximize it in a game. And I would argue that like GoldenEye on the 64, which is among the more legendary licensed games in video game history, was, I guess it sort of had some of the movie beats, kind of, but it mostly didn't. And most of what people praised about it was, oh man, like, James Bond is actually a pretty good IP to be making a cool shooter with cool guns and gadgets, right? And that's what they leveraged, and that's why it was successful.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Anyway, getting back to Crytek here, you mentioned you worked on Hunt Showdown.
I did, yeah.
Doing, was it supervising?
I was the senior producer, so okay. It was I was all things production management, much like I am here at at Abstraction. It's, staffing and schedules and budgets and clarifying team goals and milestones and shit like that.
And I don't know. It's kind of hard to ask since this thing is still in early access, but
sure.
How close is this thing to actual release? Like,
you're gonna have to talk to the current producer for that. I don't have any visibility into that anymore.
Yeah, I know you're just off of Crytek, so I don't know how which that knowledge cutoff is there. So,
well, I left Crytek in spring of last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm getting my timeline mixed up because I know you're new.
That's true. Yeah, so I had about a year or so gap in between where I ended up returning to Utah for personal reasons and was not working in the industry for a little while. But yeah, I was a consultant for a software company that made legal software. It's not important.
Right.
I've been out of touch with that project for well over a year now.
I gotcha. Okay, so I suppose that brings us to the present. And how did you get hooked up with Abstraction here?
Well, the first time that I got connected with Abstraction was actually just through a headhunter. To their credit. A guy just called me up and said, "Hey, I've got an opportunity up here in the Netherlands. Do you want to talk about it?" And I will admit that I was kind of like, well, I've never heard of these guys before. I have no idea what they do. But I thought, what the heck? It doesn't cost me a lot to take a phone call. And so we started talking and had an interview, and I really dug the guys and the studio and the city that it's in. It's a fantastic. We're located just outside of Eindhoven in the Netherlands, which is like the tech center of the country. And it's a relatively small city, but it's a big enough city to have like franchise fast food from the U.S. So apparently they must believe it's enough of a tourist attraction for that. Not that that's a metric for success of a city, but it's certainly a metric for size. You're not going to find a Five Guys in a tiny town. You just don't.
Is there a Five Guys there?
We totally have a Five Guys. Yeah. We have some other.
I didn't know they were international.
They are. There's a Five Guys in Frankfurt as well, but like Frankfurt's a city of over 1 million people. It makes a little bit more sense.
Right.
Eindhoven, depending on how you measure, it's more like 300,000-ish.
Mm-hmm.
But it's cool. It's a nice, small, walkable city. The weather's generally really mild. People are super friendly. The Netherlands has the highest English fluency of any country on earth that does not speak English as its native language. So it's pretty easy to operate here as an expat, which is nice. So I came up here and I was kind of impressed with everything. I really liked the guy. You've talked to Ralph, right? Ralph and I are buddies, and he and I really got along well. And I was really excited by the whole thing. So they offered me a job.
Mm-hmm.
I tossed and turned over it, and I was in the middle of looking at some other jobs too. And so they gave me a couple of weeks to kind of finish up some other interviews. And ultimately, I'm in the middle of a couple of things. I was in the middle of a divorce. And I have 2 kids, and they live in the United States. And so, like, my family was in the U.S. I was in Germany. My mom had some health challenges, and so I called Ralph up and I said, "Ralph, look, I know I got to give you an answer, but I got to go back to the U.S. for a bit." All right, cool. Well, it's okay. Well, good luck. And so we sort of went our separate ways, but just stayed in touch because Ralph especially. A lot of the guys here, but Ralph, I think more than anybody, we just kind of got along with. And so we stayed in touch, and we'd email from time to time, and just kind of keeping tabs. And I actually would come back to Europe periodically, and when I would like swing by the studio and just kind of say hi. And it was great. It was always really great. So after I kind of sorted everything out at home, I finally wrote Ralph an email. It was kind of funny. It was on Christmas Eve. And I wrote him an email. I was like, "Hey, Ralph, why don't we like finally work together?" And then he replied to me, and it went to my spam folder, so I didn't see it for a few weeks. But yeah, anyway, long story short, we we kind of opened up the position again, and they hired me here as head of production. My own sweet time, kind of wrapping up some affairs in the U.S. and taking a little time off. But yeah, here I am.
Indeed, indeed. And it sounds like you're enjoying things so far.
Oh, it's the best job I've ever had. Like I wouldn't even say you could compare them. I mean, granted, I'm a month in, right? So it's kind of the honeymoon phase, right. I guess. But no, man, this is the kind of job that if I were to concoct my own job, it would be this job.
Oh, that's impressive.
So it's it's the greatest thing.
Right. So with the introductions out of the way, we can move forward to the business.
Yeah.
Right. So like we've been trying to set this interview up for a couple of months, and Ralph gave me some talking points here.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, so first up is the original title, like preparations. At least when I was handed these, were underway for the original title from Abstraction Games, which I know Ralph has been wanting to do for a while. Like I think he mentioned it like last time we had him on the program. Like, it's just I don't know how to that thing.
Well, I mean, obviously I'm not Ralph, right? But there's no question, like the guy started a game company because he wanted to make games, right? Just like I work in video game industry because I want to make games. Like, yeah, and you have to understand, like, people that work in the games industry for more than about 5 years, they mostly do it because they're addicts and they're crazy, right? Working in games is extraordinarily difficult. We're doing something that's both in a lot of cases, which means you're dealing with a lot of unpredictability. And it's extremely demanding. It's a very competitive industry, and there's a line out the door of people who want to get into it. And what you'll notice is that there's a relatively small number of people who are super senior in the industry. There aren't that many, because I think most of them go after a few years. They go, I've kind of done it, and I think I would like to do something that is a little bit less work. And maybe a little bit more predictable. I mean, the games industry is also notoriously unstable, right? I mean, like game companies rise and fall all the time. So, I think when people say, "Hey, that's so cool, I want to work in games," and then they're like, "And I want to work with you guys because you're a big company and you seem so stable," I'm like, dude, there's no such thing, and like it's not. If you have to have stability, you don't work in games. But we're but those of us that are here, we're here because what we care about, especially if you're here for very long. Like I think under 5 years you get kind of a whole smattering of personality types and interests and everything, but you get past the 5-year point and it's mostly the crazy addicts that just simply can't be happy doing anything else. That's certainly true for me. I'm
like, I'd say it goes deeper than that, because like we get a lot of people on the indie circuit. Like,
sure.
And if you want to talk about instability and all that stuff, this particular part of the video game industry. And we've had a lot of people who are just getting in. They're working on their first game. They just ship the next game, and honestly, the spark is there as well, because if you're not working at the big company, man hours and such into a project.
Oh yeah, absolutely, right. I mean, but even I think there's like this illusion that just if you're at a big company that is somehow stable, right? It's like, dude, I got news for you. Every major publisher on the planet does layoffs from time to time. Like I can't think of an exception right now. There might be one.
Straight up.
Well, yeah. I mean, the games industry is because it is technically innovative and creatively innovative, right? Both of those things, like anything that's really innovative, usually means it's unpredictable. It's pretty tough to predict fun. It's pretty tough to predict cool. It's pretty, like, these things are difficult to predict. It's pretty tough to predict the next kind of technological advancement in games that's going to matter, right? These things are fairly difficult to predict. And so they, that equates to taking a lot of risk. And if you gamble and lose, it costs people jobs. So, if garage because you have a great idea and you're a diehard crazy indie developer, I mean, my hat's off to you. But obviously that's not a stable thing necessarily. It's also very risky. And if you go move into one of the cells at Ubisoft, you're still very much in danger of having that job disappear because something went wrong that was out of your control. So I don't think that it's really fair to say that anywhere in the industry is particularly stable.
I think the only place I can think of that's pretty stable is like a few companies, like say Valve, Blizzard, or Nintendo. Like, companies you just don't hear layoffs from too often. Like, but they're the exceptions, not the rules. Definitely.
Well, okay, sure. I mean, Valve of course has unlimited money, and I would argue that oddly, a ton of games despite the staff that they've got. Just because I think there's no kind of market force that's pushing them to do that, and. Blizzard, like a lot of other big companies, absolutely has the habit of hiring a bunch of guys on contracts. So instead of doing layoffs, they just don't renew contracts.
Right.
So, it's like, I guess once you're in the door, and I don't know if they can say they've never done layoffs. You'd have to fact check that, but I think that they've done it before too.
Well, there's definitely been layoffs. I'm just saying, in comparison to an EA or even like the Activision side of Activision Blizzard.
Yeah, the ones that like lay off like the entire staff for a game at the end of the game, and then rehire the ones they want again when the next one comes up.
I get it. Well, I mean, like I said, if you want to talk about the finer points of that, you're going to want to talk to those guys. But
right.
But I think that as a whole, like the games industry as a whole, is not a stable place for employment. It's not. I mean, I think it's also fair to say that if you're good at your job and you're passionate about what you do, it's generally not a job if that's what you want. But it's you might have to move a little.
Yeah, that's fair enough to say. I mean, especially since Abstraction Games is getting ambitious.
Sure, that's absolutely true.
Because like in the notations I got here, he's aiming to have this game be in what they call an indie AAA title. For those who might not know what that means, if you know what the game Hellblade is, it's that. It's a high quality game done on an indie scale.
Right.
Granted, I'm not sure how well the Hellblade experiment ultimately worked out, considering that Ninja Theory is getting bought out by Microsoft.
Well, sometimes when you get bought out, it's because you did something good.
Well, here's the thing. Ninja Theory has told the world why they're getting bought out by Microsoft. It relates to that whole instability. They feel that they will be more stable under Microsoft than they are as an independent studio. And the logic in that, it's just, when I think of unstable first parties, I think of Microsoft. Because, I don't know if you've noticed the lack of Lionhead lately.
Remember that new Fable game that's coming out? Yeah.
Well, that's maybe not a good example because we kind of reviewed that.
No, I mean the actual Fable game, not the card game.
There are rumors that are persisting that a new mainline Fable game is in development at a new developer.
On account of former developer currently dead.
Yeah. Even at Microsoft, you're a regime change away from not being there anymore.
Yeah, whoever succeeds, what's his name? I'm drawing a blank on the president of Xbox.
I'm like, Don Matrick? Is that the current head, or I think that might be a previous head? Jeez.
Whoever succeeds the current president, if they don't like your games, you're bye-bye, basically.
Yeah. I'm like, jeez, blanking. I know this, but I can't think of it. This is going to bug me all day now. Anyway, getting back, I suppose, I suppose, overall, what projects are you personally overseeing right now?
I'm the head of production, so technically all of them.
Okay, so it's just with some of these, I don't know how much we can go into because they're very early concept stuff. Like,
yeah,
you know, like,
okay.
The notations I got here is we're finally evolving the adventure game genre that was somehow left unevolved. I don't know how much you can speak to that.
Well, I mean, like, we're definitely not ready to tip the hand on the project right now. Mm-hmm. I think that it's an absolutely fair point, right? Like, there was a time when kind of the LucasArts and Sierra Adventure Games titles were, they definitely had their place, and somehow they kind of failed to continue to exist. And it's an interesting question to ask.
Yeah, mind you, this is something I vehemently disagree with, just on a conceptual level, like, because that kind of ignores things like Telltale Games and Night School Studio. Like, there's a lot of people who have been doing things with adventure games in the here and now. It's like, but anyway, perhaps we should just move on to the port work, which is the bread and butter of Abstraction Games for those who don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to remember that, like, Abstraction Games, is a very engineering focused gaming company. Most, like, a big chunk of our staff are engineers, and that's including that, like, we're not like an engine development house, right? But we're definitely an engineering focused company. Ralph himself is an engineer, as is his partner Eric. I don't know if you talked to him or not, but we're an engineering company. It's what we do. So we do difficult, technically innovative things above pretty much anything, and so we've developed some in-house technology that makes it relatively, I don't want to say easy, but certainly from a competitive standpoint, we have a competitive advantage when it comes to adapting a title from one platform to another.
Indeed, and they've done a lot of work from like
we've been around for about 10, almost 11 now, I guess. So yeah, I mean, we've done a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, probably most famously, like the Hotline Miami games, they brought that to the PlayStation 4, and indeed were a co-developer on the second one.
Yeah, indeed. And Ark Survival, putting that on any number of platforms, has also been one of the bigger projects around here.
Yeah. We talked a lot about Ark last time Ralph was here, but if I'm remembering correctly, Studio, not only do they port the game to the consoles, but they've been operating as a co-developer on like at least one of the expansion packs.
That's correct.
Yeah, and indeed, a development that has happened since the last time we had Abstraction on the program is the Nintendo Switch version, which I know a lot of people have been interested in, like ever since it got revealed at GDC.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of disbelief that this game is even running on the Switch. Because to lay it out in simple terms, like Ark is a very intensive game in terms of performance.
Sure.
And the Nintendo Switch is this hybrid console that isn't even a PlayStation 4. So basically the question here is, how are you getting this game to work in this particular space?
Well, I mean, I guess we can go into kind of the technical finer points of it. You're absolutely right? Like the Switch does not have the horsepower of a high-end or of even a PS4, right? It's not actually particularly close to that. But as I said before, like, we are an engineering company. We have extraordinarily smart people who do very technical things very, very well. And so by doing things like procedurally reducing meshes on assets and dynamically scaling the resolution in intelligent ways and things like that, we can manage some of that performance.
And like, is it the full Ark experience that's being ported to the Nintendo Switch, or is it just like the base game?
Well, what would you say is the difference? I'm pretty sure Ark is kind of Ark, isn't it?
True enough. It's just sometimes when games get moved over to a different platform, they are sometimes behind in, say, updates or content.
I'm unaware of any significant features or content that Ark Survival Evolved Switch is lacking or otherwise. Like I'm pretty sure it's pretty much that game. It's as I said, seeing as it is on the Switch, we have had to make a couple of adaptations to ensure, right? I mean, not only in terms of things like performance, but also in terms of controls and user interface and things like that.
Are you utilizing any of the unique features of the Nintendo Switch, like the HD Rumble or the touchscreen?
Yeah, we've done some tailoring for the touchscreen, so you can use the touchscreen when you're doing stuff.
Neat. Well, on the technical side of things, what sort of frame rate resolutions are you shooting for in both portable and docked mode?
Well, I think ultimately the target, it's not as much about saying, okay, we need to be this resolution at this frame rate. It's that we need to have this kind of feel and quality of a user experience at these points in the game. And so, I mean, it's pretty easy to be like, oh, well, we're going to do an upscaled 720p at 30 hertz at least everywhere we can, but better than that when we can and worse than that when we have to. But, you have to understand that, even Breath of the Wild dips below 20 frames at certain points in the game. It's just that you don't notice because of the way that they handle it.
Right.
So I think that we're trying to, rather than be like, okay, here's a frame rate benchmark, hit this or else. I think it's more of a well, no, we're looking at this thing holistically from a qualitative standpoint. And that I guess there's a range of parameters within there that seem to work depending on what the context is.
Are you using a high dynamic range in terms of resolution?
Well, we scale the resolution sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a very common thing on the Switch.
Yeah, right.
Based on what's going on at any given moment. And it's probably the best way to do that because there are certain games on the Switch that don't do this and they don't run very well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, you're working with fewer resources, so you gotta find it somewhere.
Indeed. Now, in terms of the levels and the geometry, have you had to make any adjustments for the Switch on that level?
Well, I mean, as I said, we have done some procedural reduction of some of the meshes and things like that.
Right.
And there are a couple of other tricks I mentioned. There are some others. I won't bore you with the technical details. But yeah, I think we're trying to find places where we can ease the demand on the system without compromising the quality to the player. Right? I think there are a lot of places where we can reduce the number of triangles in a given asset, and it doesn't really look significantly different, even though it's got way fewer of them in it. So there are opportunities like that.
Oh, that's good to hear. Because, yeah, like I said, people were literally in disbelief that Ark was working on the Switch. And as well as
believe it, baby, it's there. I saw it today.
I know. It's just I saw the online chatter around, say, GDC was, if it was running on the Switch, it was going to run at a terrible frame rate, basically.
And something wizards.
Yeah. A frame rate of a postage stamp and things like that. No.
Well, I mean, like I said, man, we've got very talented engineers. We are not banging rocks together.
No, I know. I'm just, this was the feedback. And I suppose the next question is, how far along is the Switch port at this point?
Very, very far along. I mean, we're just wrapping the thing up, actually. I don't know if Wildcard have said like what they intend for street dates, but yeah, we're in the very final stages of getting that done.
Well, that's good. Right, and so moving onwards to the other Ark, the spin-off, Pix Ark? Is that how
you... Pix Ark is what it's called, yeah.
Yeah. Like, so this is, if you don't know what this one is, this is basically Minecraft Ark.
Like, I had my money on Standard Ark Survival Evolved, except with Pixar characters instead of dinosaurs.
Yeah, you're going to have to talk to Disney licensing about that if you want to do that. But yeah, no, I think, if you're putting together your elevator pitch, that's actually a pretty good summary, right? It's a game that has a lot of the core gameplay of Minecraft, like, voxel-based building and world destruction and things, and then you still have, cool creatures that you can interact with in cool ways from Ark, all in kind of that voxel-ish art style. Yeah, that's true.
Now, are you? Is what you're doing on PicArks here the same as Ark, as in handling all the console versions?
That's correct. So we're doing the console adaptations of that.
Have those been released yet, or are those still in development?
No, they're still in development. Yeah, they're still chugging right along, and we should be tying those up here in a few weeks as well. But yeah, no, there's nothing out there yet. I think you can play the game in early access,
right?
But only on one or two platforms. So no, like there's still a lot of stuff that nobody's seen.
Now on PicArks, do you coordinate with games on that, or is it all pure Studio Wildcard?
No. Like we interface regularly with Snail Games as well. Like we talk to them. It gets kind of fun because my Mandarin's pretty terrible, but they're good guys. We talk to them really regularly.
Bit ironic there, since if I'm recalling correctly, this is developed at their USA branch.
Oh well, I mean, there's definitely dudes in the like we use like a like a chat program to talk to them, and a lot of them chatter in Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
So my Mandarin's pretty terrible. It's even worse than my Dutch, which is saying something. But they're still very much like the primary developer of the game, and we're helping them with adaptations. That's the arrangement.
Mm-hmm. And let's see here. Up next is SNK Heroines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what work exactly are you doing on this title?
Well, we are doing some addition. Well, I don't know. This one's a little bit tough because it's mostly platform tailoring and stuff. I guess it's probably the best way to put it. I wouldn't say it's strictly adaptations, and I wouldn't say it's strictly co-development. It's kind of a fuzzy one. But yeah, we are working on that one. Heroines. It's kind of cool. It's like the next King of Fighters thing.
Right. I'm like, are you working on just a, say, PlayStation 4 or Switch version of it, or like?
This is one where I'm actually not at liberty to discuss the platform schedule for this one. They don't want me talking about it, so I'm not gonna. But what I can say is it's coming to some other stuff. Sorry, I hate to do that to you, but yeah, man, I gotta protect my client.
Well, seeing a few years ago we accidentally got somebody in trouble for mentioning that. Yeah, it's better to not.
Yeah, so we're gonna try to avoid doing that here.
Yeah, there's a rule of thumb when we're on air: if check your NDAs.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so that's exactly what we're doing. But yeah, we are doing some work for them for some shit, and it's coming to various platforms near you.
Okay. Yeah. I'm like, and there's also Spike Chunsoft, and recalling a Abstraction's done a bunch of work for them over the years.
Yeah.
Like doing the various parts of Danganronpa, and recalling correctly, 428. Up here, not.
That is correct.
Okay, I'm leaving soon.
Whoa.
Oh,
Whoa,
bye,
hold on.
Golix.
Is it right over there?
Yeah, I think he has to leave for work.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway, so 428. For those who don't know, what is this?
Sorry about that.
It's fine. Go. You can head to work.
Okay, yeah, I gotta
Do
go.
what you gotta do, man.
Sorry.
Get that paper. Yeah. So I mean, 428 is like all but wrapped internally, and mostly was before I actually got here. So I don't know that I'm really particularly close to that project, but it's one that they've like all but wrapped up.
Mm-hmm. Like, I believe he talked about it pretty extensively when he was on the program, which was a while ago.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it would have been a big, like, you know, like I like to think of, you know, because we have a bunch of projects going on here. Like at Abstraction has always had a lot of plates to spin, and I kind of I made this joke here earlier where I just said, hey, you know, we have all these projects, and I kind of think of all these projects like they're children and they're running away from a hungry bear, and there's always one project that's the fattest, slowest kid, right? And that's the one that you're like, you know, that you want to make sure you're paying attention to because it's the one that has the potential for the most things to go wrong, I guess, right? Where you're running up against tight deadlines and you have complicated problems and you need to kind of focus on it. And for kid, so I haven't spent as much time on it.
Right. Fair enough.
That project's going according to plan. Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
And indeed, on that note, from what I got from Ralph, the Abstraction Games is expanding.
That is very true.
Yeah, he says 15 more people with over the next 6 months to bring the total of people working at the studio to 55.
That's right. In fact, I think it might actually end up being a little bit higher than that. But we are very actively recruiting right now. And the company has been kind of on this growth trajectory for the last little bit. I mean, like the company started as 2 guys in a garden shed behind Ralph's father-in-law's house 10, you know, almost 11 years ago. And now we're hovering kind of around 40-ish, a little bit more than that, I guess, and continuing to hire very aggressively. So we've had some success. We have some thoughts on how to have more of it, and we're looking to get some more people in the Abstraction family. Absolutely.
Indeed. And as far as other projects go, is there anything here and now?
What I can tell you is that we're doing more than one thing internally right now. We have more than just the adventure thing you mentioned before. So we're getting to where we've got a healthy mix of the adaptation work, which we still enjoy doing and are still really good at, and a couple of internal things as well, which is part of why we're staffing up, right? We're staffing up to be able to spin up a couple of, some more properties internally.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah. Exciting times, man.
All right. I think that'll about do it for this session.
Cool.
Yeah. Oh, it was nice getting to know you. Sorry about, the questions we had developed here were for Ralph.
It's all good.
Anyway, so still, we would like to have you back again in the future whenever the next wave of projects are ready to be talked about.
You just let me know. No, I was happy to do this, you guys. This is a lot of fun. I'm glad you guys are doing this. Yeah, that's cool.
All right, so that'll about do it for this session. Be sure to tune in tomorrow where, well, it's going to be a double topic week because the guest had to cancel. It happens. So, we're going to be talking about the Mega Man X Legacy Collection and Sonic Mania Plus.
Oh, cool.
So, until then, I wish you good gaming.
All right, thanks, guys.